Welcome to the Founders Foyer with me, Aishwarya. This foyer is full of conversations. The space where creators, founders, and builders can look for all the concepts to grow their ideas into products. Building products is so much fun, right? But at the same time, it's equally exhausting and challenging with so many peers to work with, market needs to look into, and a lot of processes to go by. While frameworks and techniques can be compelling to share, they are very hard to standardize for different software teams and their cultures. So, what are some ways to navigate these complexities and build better software? With me today is Alan Holub, an internationally recognized software architect, consultant, and trainer who is extremely passionate about helping product builders and founders improve their effectiveness, get better at finding solutions, and deliver software that's actually valuable to customers. Hey, Alan, it's wonderful to chat with you on my show today.
Hi, nice to be here.
Hi. Hello. So, let's get started with how your journey into software began. From serving to big parts to going on to leading startup teams as a CTO to now consulting and training so many builders. How did this change happen for you, and what does this journey look like?
It was very gradual. I started out as a hardware designer. I was a robot builder, and
Oh,
back then, the best CPUs we could find were not supported very well by the companies that made them. As Motorola, in particular, they didn't have compilers, they didn't have operating systems, they didn't have anything. So I was tasked with building a compiler for the
mm,
for uh, Motorola's 68,000 family machine. And then I was tasked for building an operating system because we didn't have one of those. And by the time those two projects were finished, I was a software guy instead of a hardware guy. So that's that's how it started. And then, from there on, it was sort of a gradual evolution. Is that I've been a consultant for most of that time. Most of the time after that, I worked for normal companies for over 10 years, and then decided I just couldn't take it anymore and started working for myself.
sure.
And the thing about what I do now compared to what I do then is that this was back in the late '80s, and um, we were a very agile shop. The word agile didn't exist yet, but we were doing things in extremely agile ways. And I've talked to other friends, people like Bob Martin, and he's had exactly the same experience. Right, we were all working in agile ways long before the Agile Manifesto came. So when agile came along, none of it was particularly surprising to me.
Mm,
I did a brief stint where I believed in the capability maturity model and all that kind of stuff, and I was never really happy with that.
yeah.
And when I finally decided, wait a minute, this is just not working, and what we were doing before worked really well, um, I became much happier. So it was sort of the Agile Manifesto and Kent Beck's book on XP that kind of bumped me out of the whole hardcore process thing to something more flexible. So,
Mhm. Yeah.
the original company, as I said, it was very agile. We didn't have any manager. We were autonomous. We were self-organizing. We designed as we went. We built
Mm,
stuff. We built stuff and released it and got feedback and fixed it based on the
yeah.
feedback. Got all we're doing all of the stuff that really defines what agile is, and it's just a better way to work. And anyway, I was happy returning to it.
Absolutely. No, I think it's such a like a very steep change at each point in time. And I love how you just said, "Oh yeah, we had this problem. We just picked it up and we started working towards it." And it sounds like so much of learning that you had back then when you try to go through the hardware towards the software kind of a journey. And I wanted to bring this up, the whole sprint concept, and like how is agile treated back then, especially there was this whole thing considered as a methodology, and suddenly all the product teams across the world was moving towards it. And then back now, we still follow some of these processes, but then there's like each team follows their own way. And like we try to figure out what really works for us. But the crux remains the same, right? Like you build something, you put it up to the audience, you gauge the interest, and then you go on to iterate. So yeah, I think
Right.
it's sort of come as a full circle, like how you mentioned, like getting back
Oh,
to
I
what
don't
you
think
really
so.
want.
Well, agile is not a methodology, though. It's not a
Mhm.
methodology at all. And
Exactly.
the frameworks that call themselves agile are not. And I include Scrum in that category. It's not particularly agile. The word agile does not appear anywhere in the Scrum book.
Mm, mm,
And the it's really all about learning, right? Which is what we were doing. We were agile, but we were doing it the hard way, right? We were discovering things as we went along,
right.
and right, and we would do what you're supposed to do. Was we would look at what we're
Mm.
doing, and if it wasn't working, we'd figure out some other way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And the ultimately that's what agility is about, is learning and taking what you learn and incorporating it into what you do.
Hmm.
And the whole methodology thing just drives me crazy, is that that's as
Yeah.
far
Totally.
removed from agile as it could possibly be.
Yeah.
You know, and I
Yeah.
that there are a bunch of people that say I hate agile. And when you say, so what are you doing instead? And then they'll talk about
Yeah.
what they're doing. And what they're doing is
Which
agile.
is
Right?
exactly.
It's not Scrum or Safe or something
Yeah.
like that, but it's very agile. So I
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's more of a mindset, like you say, in terms of like looking at it more from what it really means. Like, don't look at it as like a methodology, because that it is not. But often, I think back then people were looking at it like as though it's the next kind of a thing to adapt. But even today, like you said, what people do is typically what you do in the agile as from a definition front. Yeah. On that, I would like to dig a bit more deeper, because when we spoke about putting it to the audience, trying to iterate it, there's often this phrase that most teams go by. It's like, oh, let's just stay fast. Let's just try to get as much as learning possible, as opposed to working smart, getting feedback, and adjusting.
Mhm.
So, what's your take on this approach? And of course, which one would you lean more towards? And why would fail fast be right or wrong? What's your take on it?
Well, fail fast. The way it was originally intended, the phrase, was that you should experiment.
Yeah.
And if the experiment doesn't work, that's fine. Do something else. So the idea was to make the experiments as small as possible. So if they didn't work, you didn't lose a lot. And that way of thinking strikes me as fine. I have no problems with that. But fail fast has kind of turned, in some circles, has turned into something else entirely, which has to do with almost being reckless as compared to doing reasonable experimentation, right? Experimenting with stuff. And what fail fast really is about is build something, give it to people, see what they say,
Mm.
and if they don't like it, build something else, right? But it wasn't this reckless thing like, let's just do crazy stuff. Let's not talk to people, and the sometimes fast is defined as months, right? Where the original definition of fast was hours, right? Is that
Yeah.
it was to do very small experiments and see how things work. And Agile still works that way, right? Is that it's still all based on experimentation. Everything we do is an experiment. Every
Mm.
story that we produce is an experiment. And if the experiment doesn't work out, we throw it out and do something else. Is people hold on to their code a little bit too tightly, right? They hold on to it as if it's something valuable. And if it's not working, it's not valuable. So one of the key tenets of working in an agile way, from my point of view, is that we have to be willing to throw out anything or throw
Yes.
out everything, right? If it's not working, it's not valuable. So let's throw it out. And people get caught in this whole sunk cost
Yeah.
world, right? And they don't want to get let go of stuff. And they say, well, we spent all this money building it. And I'm going, well, if it's not working, then
Mm.
what have you accomplished, right? And you see a lot of that with bigger system, admittedly.
Yeah.
But no matter how big it is, if it's not working, it's not working. It's that there's
Mm.
no advantage to holding on to it particularly. So, um, so anyway, getting back to fail fast though, the original intent of the phrase makes sense, but what it's turned into makes less sense to me. If your only goal is to break things, you end up producing stuff that turns out in the long term to not be very desirable. And it's not a good situation to be in, but that's what you get from move fast and break things, right? You get somewhere where you didn't want to be, right? You
Yeah.
broke too much, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, taking the phrase in a very literal sense, and but what are you moving fast for? What are you like breaking things for? Or what are you failing fast for is something that people forget, like you mentioned. Like, it's your customer. If it's not working, it's not working. It's not the fact that, oh, just because I built it, it's very dear to me, so I just want to go ahead with it. And that's, I think, somewhere like you said, the phrase taken in a very literal sense then adapts to you as a builder, and you're not like really coming out of your own mindset zone to say that, but well, this space was not for me. It was for the folks
Yeah.
that I'm building the product for.
Well, and I think yes, and I also think the word fast is a bad thing, right? I
Mm.
think Jeff Sutherland in that completely idiotic, twice the work and half the time stuff. That's just it's insanely bad. He should know better. And Agile is not particularly faster than any other way of working. It's just that what you end up with is better.
Mm.
And it's only faster in the sense that we don't waste a lot of time building stuff that nobody wants. Right. So if you pull out of a project all the stuff that nobody wants, you're going to get done sooner. But the only way to do that is by releasing frequently. And it gets us back to
Yeah.
experiment, right? Is that we want to experiment often enough that we can identify the things that we shouldn't be building and then not build those things. And that's what
Mhm.
makes it faster. Right.
Yeah.
It's not nothing inherent in the way of working, particularly. It's
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. With you on that. And let's talking about getting to that better part, right? It's not as much as the frequency, it's also knowing what to ship and like not exactly like 100% match, but how to get better at it at each stage. So here I'm sort of thinking about something like discovery. So as small agile team, when you're trying to do experiments and ship something out for your audience. Are
Mhm.
there any ways that you think we can get better at customer discovery, like trying to understand okay, I can get as process this into understanding these market requirements or these kind of problems to solve. So when you advise a couple of, builders or teams, have you like suggested some of these discovery techniques to them?
You just need to talk to them, right? All too many companies, you can't talk to customers, right? The one of the things that I really, really intensely dislike about Scrum is the product owner role,
Mm,
because what happens is that, well, it doesn't have to work this way, right? I have a lot of people that are Scrum people who I respect, and they say, no, 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 this is bad Scrum. But unfortunately, the vast majority of Scrum shops that I see, they would categorize as bad Scrum. So the idea of the product owner standing between the customer and the dev team is
mhm,
really bad, right? Because the dev team is not actually getting real feedback. Everything's going through a filter. It's as if you're playing a game of telephone, right? Where you pass a phrase around a circle, a bunch of kids sit in a circle and they whisper to the kid next to them. And gradually you pass the phrase around. And when it comes all the way back around, it's not what you started with. And the what people don't realize, there have been actual studies done on the game of telephone, and a bunch of grad
mm,
student time on their hand. And what they find is that the kids actually are changing things deliberately in order to make it funnier. And when you talk
mm,
about a PO, the PO is going to be changing things for political reasons or because it benefits them in some way with inside a hierarchical organization or because they feel compelled to do things in a certain way because they think that the product strategy requires it. Um, the problem is that everything gets put through that filter and what comes out may not be what the customers are actually asking.
mm.
So the important thing is to talk to them. And the other part of that is to talk to them frequently, as too many people who are doing things like Scrum don't talk to them nearly often enough.
Yeah.
So thinking about sprint planning, for example, um, up until the point where you start the sprint, a story is 2 or 3 sentences that remind you to have a conversation with your customers. So the idea of a PO sitting down for hours and adding detail after detail after detail to a story, that's just not right. That's just wrong. So it starts as a few sentences. And then what sprint planning is about is to sit down and actually have that conversation.
Yeah.
So you're doing it right before you're building, hours, not days or months, but hours before you're building. You have a conversation and you collect enough information to start, not to finish, but to start. And then as you're working, you have additional conversations. Here, come here, take a look at this. Right. I have, this just appeared on Twitter today, actually, as I was discussing this subject. And
Right.
what he said is, well, we build a system so that every time we do a commit, and we're committing as often as every 18 or 20 minutes, that automatically sends a email out to a list of people that are interested in participating so that they can find out what they want to do. And he says, and they get back to us within minutes, usually, of those emails coming out if they're interested in the part of the system we're working on. So I think that's a great idea, right? You're getting feedback immediately,
Mm,
and you're getting feedback as you're working.
mm.
So you don't have to worry about getting stuff wrong because you're constantly doing these tiny little 20-minute
Yeah.
experiments and getting feedback on it, right? And so it's all about communication. Is the
Mm,
right? Ron Jeffries talks about the 3 C's about cards and communication is the most important, right? Is that it's the thing that we have to do most often. And the card part of the story is is just those 2 or 3 sentences
mhm.
till we have the communication. And
Yeah.
then the last C is a confirmation, which is something that's happening again constantly because we're having these constant conversations
Conversations.
and getting the feedback, right? Confirmation isn't isn't a sprint review 2 weeks after things are finished, right? It's happening constantly as you're talking, and it happens when you're talking about what comprises the story, and it happens while you're working on the story, and then of
Mm.
course it happens afterwards, right? Is the stuff that's coming in from even from tech support that's part of the confirmation process.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so the main thing, Agile is very simple, and the this part of it is just like talk to people. It's not hard,
Mm.
right? You don't need lots of metrics and all the other bizarre stuff that people talk about. It's just talk to people, and talk to
Yeah.
each other, and talk to actual customers, and talk to everybody, right?
Yeah, I mean,
All
I
the
was just going to say talk to each other as well because it's the communication that's going to be within the team and as well as with the
yeah,
customers that you directly work with.
yeah,
'Cause,
which is one of the reasons I'm a big fan of like ensemble program,
mhm,
mob program.
mhm,
Because again, it's all about the conversation is continuous. And when people do things using the isolated, what I think of as the isolated individual model, the lone cowboy who goes off on their own and works for even a whole day by themselves and then comes back and talks to people. That's not enough talking.
yeah,
And
yeah,
the whole, if you look at Scrum is kind of designed assuming that that's what's going to happen, right? The daily Scrum, the stand up. What that really is a way for people who are working as individuals to coordinate at the beginning of the day and make some kind of plan about how they're going to proceed through the rest of the day. And then they all scatter and do things without talking to other people. And of course, things
mhm.
will be wrong. And then in theory, the next time you meet in the morning, you'll correct it, but that's not really a
It's
good
too
start.
late to
Too
align
late.
by that
It's
time.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think here is where co-creation, like you said, matters a lot because when you understand that there's a certain problem to solve, let's say like a team of product manager, engineers, and designers sitting together and trying to brainstorm and trying to get something done. I also believe in the fact that you need a lot of co-creation because if each of us, like if the developer is on a very different range and if the PM is on a very different range and the designer doesn't know, okay, where am I supposed to build all of this together? It's just going to be like three different people working in three different directions. And really,
Yeah.
it's not going to help in the kind of experiment we're talking about because what you ship is not going to be anywhere attuned with what problem you want to try and solve. So yeah, I
Well,
think
I think that we need all of those skills working together. Product. Let's mix product into it too. We need all of those skills literally working together over the
yeah,
course of the day in order to do the best possible product.
yeah,
And the idea of a designer doing things up front and then passing it on to the team, which then builds it and then maybe passes it on to testers, I just don't think that that's a particularly good way to work. It's that it's too inefficient. Is that
mm,
you get too many things wrong and then have to go back and do it over
mm,
again. And if you're working with all of those, if you're working in an ensemble with all of those skills represented literally in the room, be it a virtual room or a physical one, um, you don't have those problems, right? The little problems when they come up are solved immediately. So it just works better.
and also like when you suggest or when you want to like really get into that concept and try to say, oh, here's my suggestion, or here's my opinion. It makes more sense when you got it from the point of understanding what it really takes to do that and not just get like blind suggestions or like just trying to go on and oh this is something you can do and without having like a base or a ground understanding of what you're really doing there. So yeah, on that context, it doesn't hurt to know about and if, like you said, even though you're not like a like I like for example, I don't code day by day, but then when I'm going to talk to my engineer on my team and trying the both of us are trying to brainstorm and trying to see what little experiment to run for our customers, I have to understand from the context of okay, what it takes to actually build this, and like, I can't just blindly suggestions there and say, oh, this is easy and let's just go and do this and whatever cost may be.
Right.
That makes sense. Yeah. And since we're talking about the whole close knit communication and the kind of conversations that teams should have about this,
Mhm.
what I want to go on next is when teams are small, it's sort of the daily communication and passing over the suggestions and feedback is slightly easier as compared to let's say when the teams grow and there's like multiple stakeholders, multiple tools, and here's where the whole term of processes creep in. And I've seen some of your tweet where you say, there's no low performing teams. It's only like the systems that actually prevent them from doing a good job. So how do you think as teams scale, this communication part should be maintained and this whole thing shouldn't get lost?
Well, there is the way the Spotify engineers put it is that you have autonomy and you have alignment,
Yeah.
and both are equally important. So the teams are autonomous in the sense that they get to choose how they work. I paraphrase the Scrum Guide. They're self-managing, which is to say they get to choose what they work on, how they're going to do the work, and when they do it.
Yeah.
That's, a lot of people who do Scrum have not read that for some reason. I don't know. It's right there in the Scrum Guide in black and white. It makes perfect sense to me. Right. So, um, however, in order to do that effectively, you have to coordinate with other teams. And the whole Scrum things, I think, is nuts because it's not really coordination. It's just the boss of one team talking to the bosses of other teams, right? The Scrum Master is not supposed to be a boss, but that's the way it works anyway in that kind of environment. Is that I'm much happier with something like the Spotify guild model,
Yeah.
where you have the idea of a guild is that, well, let's take UX as a case in point, right? There'll be UX issues that span all of the work that all of the teams are doing. And when you're working on something as a team, what you're working on is likely to impact things that other teams are working on. So you have guild meetings once or twice a week, maybe, or as often as
Yeah.
necessary. The people on the teams that are most interested in UX get together and have a guild meeting, and they hash out all of the UX related issues that the teams are working on.
Yeah.
Right, the same with database and whatever else, whatever other specialty that you need, and that way everybody stays aligned, but at the same time is working autonomously, and that works really well, and it scales just fine.
Yeah.
The whole idea of scaling Agile is just craziness. It's usually, if you look at when people say we have to scale Agile, what they mean is we're going to put in a lot of bureaucracy that prevents it from being Agile. Right? You can't be more Agile by adding bureaucracy. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Agile just by itself scales just fine. And, I've certainly seen, well, look at Spotify, right? Spotify works the way I'm describing, and they have about 1,000 programmers, which is not enterprise level, but it's fine. And I would argue if you're working on anything that requires more than 1,000 programmers, then you've got to really rethink about what you're working on. There is no system on the planet that needs more than 1,000 programmers working on it. I'm sorry. And if it's bigger than that, it means that you have to divide the system up
Mhm.
into smaller cooperative
Smaller.
subsystems that are independent from each other, right? It's that you don't scale the process up, you scale the work down so
Mm.
that the process will work on it.
Yeah.
And I have yet to see something that couldn't be scaled down. I'm sorry. I did the people push back on that when they work for giant corporations, but I just don't buy it. It's the kind of the corporate wisdom, but it's not something that I agree with.
Yeah.
So, it's all about working small and coordinating and, autonomy mixed with alignment. I think that
Mm.
that, that's enough.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's very practical as well because even as you get bigger as an org, the kind of problems you try and solve is they're still going to revolve around tiny charts and experiments that you want to run. Right? Like at that scale, you can't have like 10 teams take up the same problem to solve and then like try to mess up by bringing in different opinions inside without a proper clarity on okay, yeah, here's how we want to go about this. So yeah, I think
Sure.
authority, alignment really as a combination makes sense.
Yeah, and if you a lot of it has to do with architecture and Conway's law. Um, Conway's law is really important, and people don't think about it, and they need to. And the structure Conway's law says that simplify the structure of the organization maps to the structure of the architecture and vice versa.
Mhm.
So, um, you need an architecture that's going to support working that way. If you have an
Yeah.
n-tiered architecture where the individual teams are each in charge of their own layer,
Mhm.
and trying to make a thin vertical slice through all of the layers is very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And so there the architecture is fighting against agility. It's preventing you from being agile because a team cannot take an idea all the way into the customer's hands. It has to interact with all of these other teams to get the database done. And all of that adds delays and bottlenecks, right? If you have a separate database group, it could take 3 weeks to get a change made to the database that you need to get the current story out the door. So you need an architecture then in an agile world that doesn't do that. And there are choices there, right? I'm a big fan of domain-driven design, and I think those architectures that are domain-focused
Mhm.
um, tend to split the work up in ways that make sense from an agile perspective. So if you look at user stories, say you're doing an online store, um, there are user stories that are going to be catalog focused. There are going to be user stories that are going to be um, warehouse focused or shipping focused or finance focused. But the finance stories tend not to bleed into the other contexts, right? If you're doing a catalog story, it's probably not going to impact the warehouse. So teams then can focus, right? They can say, okay, we work mostly on warehouse stories,
Mhm.
and we work mostly on catalog stories, and that's fine, right? And that way, you need less coordination because the stories don't interact as much.
Mhm.
But when they do interact, of course, you have to talk to each other. You have to communicate. So
Yeah.
you can do things to lower the need for interaction by having a good architecture, a good underlying architecture.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, boils down to the foundation of it. And it's something that people can easily miss, considering that at that level of discussion, it's never boiling down to foundations. It's always like, oh, but then we have this problem to solve. Let's just look at this at hand. But if you don't have a good foundation, like you don't have like a good architecture in plan, obviously things are going to delay and it's going to take its time in getting launched.
That's
So
right.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And since we're talking about the whole let's get this simplified concept, often I think like we say it, let's just do simple experiments, but um, it's not in trying to do this. It's something that's very simple. Rather, it's also dependent on de-risking, right? Like when you remove complexity from something, it automatically becomes simple. So
Right.
have you like tried some of that with, let's say, any teams that you advise in terms of trying to look at it as not to adapt simpler practices, but trying to eliminate what could be as complexities within the
Well, I
team.
don't try to eliminate work. I try and not do the work to begin with.
Mhm.
Right. So if you're working with test driven development, for example, you come up with a story, you write a test that an acceptance test that tells you that you're done. And then you write exactly enough code to get that test to pass. So when it passes, you're finished. You don't write a line more, right? You don't add an argument to a function because it might be useful at some point in the future. You do exactly what's needed to implement the code in front of you. And the same goes for architecture, is that I think architecture must develop incrementally as the system develops.
Mhm.
You don't sit down and try and build this giant complex thing, right? Based on some fantasy about what you're going to be like 10 years from now, right? As we are not Netflix, is the way I like to say that. And so as a consequence, we don't need anything nearly as complicated as what they do. So you start off with the simplest architecture that you can have to handle the stories that you have. And you started off with the simplest possible implementation of the story that handles exactly what's in front of you.
Mhm.
And then we're agile. So if something new comes along, you change it, you make changes. And if that means you have to throw it out, fine, because the code that we have, if it doesn't work, is not valuable.
Mhm.
Um, Now, it's been my experience that if you approach things in a agile-ish way, you tend to not have to throw things out. It's another thing I have about domain-driven design, right? Is you are with domain-driven design, your architecture is literally modeling the domain. There's a one-to-one correspondence between the structure
Yeah.
of the domain and the structure of the architecture. So as the needs of the system evolve, you're not going to be making significant changes because the domain hasn't changed.
Mhm.
So the architecture that you already have is the correct architecture because it's modeling the domain. Might get bigger in places and maybe smaller in places, but it's not going to change in ways that are going to cost you 3 months of development time or a year of development time. Because the
Mhm.
architecture is sensitive.
Mhm.
So, a lot of times people fail at Agile because they don't have an architecture and a code base that allows them to be Agile. And it's a big part of the equation. I think when I do a lot of work that involves organizational assessment, when I come in and I look at an organization and do that for a week or two and then talk to the C levels about
Mhm.
what I see is wrong and what's right and where they can make changes and that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
A lot of that, a big part of that is looking at the architect, looking at the
Right.
software,
Right.
right? And one of the problems with a lot of the quote agile consultants, which is I am one, but I hate to call myself that because you get people like Deloitte and these giant consulting companies, and these consultants come in and they've never coded anything in their life. They can't look at a piece of software architecture and tell you whether it's good or not or appropriate or not because they've never done it.
Yeah.
The only people that are really competent at this are people that have the whole skill set, and the really good consultants do that. Hardly any of them work for big consultancies, so they're mostly working as individuals or for very small companies. I've done some work with
Right.
Industrial Logic, for example. It's a very small company, but they've got a lot of very good people who
Mhm.
have real hands-on experience doing all this stuff so they can give good advice. And it's important.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And Is it the same thing that happens, let's say, since you mentioned about the whole organization competence, you look at the architecture,
Mhm.
how different is this from, let's say, like a scaled up org as opposed to, let's say, like a very tiny startup or like a very, very small team that's just approaching you in terms of like getting better at solution, getting better at what they do. So have you seen like any contrast, or is it always been the same kind of an approach that you've seen in terms of building that architecture out with a scaled up org as opposed to a startup?
It's all the same from my point of
Mm,
view.
mm,
Is the big corporations put obstacles in their way that they need to get rid of. A lot of those are political, and a
mm,
lot of those are inessential, right? A big corporation with a giant hierarchical tree, right, that covers the whole corporation is what value does that have? It has none, right? Is that so? The first thing you have to do is break up those organizations into smaller cooperative organizations.
right.
W.O. Gore is famous for that, right? When a division gets more than 150 or 200 or so people, they split it into two divisions.
Sure.
And the you have to keep things at a small scale in order to be agile, but a large company can be made up of smaller divisions, if you lack of a better word, right? Is that the problem is when they take the divisions and they divide by functionality or tech
Right.
rather than by product, right? So,
Mm,
you have a giant database group that does database for the entire enterprise. You don't want that, right? Is that you want individual products to be under the control of a cohesive group. And
mm,
that group does everything needed in order to get that product out the door. And if it doesn't jibe with things that people are doing over somewhere else, then that's fine, right? And there's this myth in large corporations that standardization is somehow good. And it's been my experience that it's not, that you don't want to standardize. You want to optimize for the situation in front of you, and
mm.
optimize for needs of the product that's in front of you, and not standardize.
Yeah.
Standardize, what you end up with is vast amounts of unnecessary complexity.
Yeah. And you wouldn't have the right grounds to standardize as well because situation keeps changing. And then what you're solving at that moment won't really matter with the
Right.
standardization that you make.
And
So
the ultimate expression of that is microservices, right? Which all have their own databases, and they have their own UIs, and they're the little tiny thing that is completely independent of everything else. So the standardization is not important there. You might even have multiple languages across the set of microservices. It's fine.
mm, mm. Yeah. And most often teams tend to take these microservices and do like a layer on top because it's just not like a take it and fit it because they have to obviously like take it up and then try to see how it fits the context. So if
Yeah, but
standardization
if
is
you put
done,
if you put a layer on top of it, it's not really microservices anymore. It's something else, right? It's some kind
yeah,
of hybrid.
yeah. No, which is exactly brings to the point of the whole standardization doesn't really make sense because when you take it up, it's contextual to what you want to be using. So again, it sort of defies the whole purpose.
That's right.
Yeah. So yeah, and so one of the last segment of the chat is like I want to dig a bit deeper into your thoughts around the team mindset and like in terms of setting some of the team cultures when it comes to like very, very early stage team trying to build a product out. I would love to know your thoughts on a couple of things. So the first one being I often see that when you write about the word accountability, you'd rather want it to be replaced with trying getting the team to feel more committed or trying to work towards excellence as opposed to trying to say that you have to be accountable to a certain job. And this is more than often relevant for early stage teams because everybody's trying to work together to ship something out for the first time. So what are the other phrases or what are the other things that you think are very misled in such early stage teams? And what's your take on?
Well, certainly that notion of accountability is a big one, right? And commitment either. I don't believe in commitment either, at least in the sense of committing to a company or something, right? Yeah, it
Mm,
seems reasonable for the people on the team to commit to each other because they're in a social relationship. But committing to doing a set of stories or committing to anything concrete, tactical, I think is kind of a disease. The same applies to accountability, which is all about punishment. Right.
mm,
In other words, would you rather that somebody did a good job because they were accountable, that they would be held accountable if they didn't do the good job? Or would you rather they did a good job because they really loved what they were working on and were motivated to do it and were working with people that they really liked to work with? Right. Is that it's a much better place to be in. It's, ultimately what it comes down to is we're people, right? And we work in social units. People have worked together in social units since cavemen went out as a team and brought down a mastodon to bring back for dinner, right? And uh, the corporate look, which is newish, has
Mm.
kind of moved away from something that that human beings have been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. It's not going to work. So the idea of people ordering people around, that wasn't really a significant part of anything, right? And people bring up the military and stuff, but if you actually look at the real military, the the people on top, the generals come up with strategy, but the people in the individual squads decide what to do because
Mm.
there's no time, right? If you're in a battle, you can't like call somebody and ask for permission. Right? And the same reasoning applies to working in an agile kind of way, is the teams can't ask for permission to do stuff. They just have to do it. And the that's all. So you have a culture that's based on being human, about trusting people,
Mhm.
about putting together good people and letting them do the work, is take away obstacles for not being able to do good work.
Right.
Right. So the culture of agile is just the culture of being a human being. There's nothing special about it. It's weird. It seems weird because the corporate culture is not about being a human being. It's about some other weird thing that's not a very natural thing, I think, for humans to do. But we've come to look at it as a norm, but
Mm.
it's not really. And if you think about it, that kind of cultural norm, that corporate cultural norm, that's only been with us for probably less than 100 years. Um, my theory is that a lot of it started with World War II, because a lot of the what were then kids went off and joined the army, right? Everybody was in the army. And they did that in their 20s, and then they came back and they formed companies. And the only way they knew to run their companies was the way that the army was running, because that's what they learned. They learned management by looking at the military. And we're not an army, though, right? We are not the military. Is to trying to organize our companies that way, just from my point of view, doesn't work very well.
Right. Yeah.
So we want to get back to a more 18th century
Human.
way of looking at things than
Yeah.
the 19th
Like
or 20th
getting
century.
getting back to what you should be doing, which is trusting people that they do their best. And also, I think it boils down to kind of hiring people that way, because when you yeah, you match when you know, okay, here's what I can do my piece of work, and I can do it in a very trusted way, and you automatically start attracting folks who would want to feel more connected with people rather than trying to go by like permissions, or like trying to go by a more authoritative kind of work.
Well, yeah, and it's about helping each other and working collaboratively and mentoring and all of
Mm.
that stuff, right? And there is not enough of that in the corporate world, and there needs to be more of it. Corporate world seems to promote competition between people, right? You think about individual performance reviews. It means that you are now competing with everybody on your team, and
Mm.
you want a bigger share of the zero sum bonus. So you're not going to take your skills and teach them to anybody else, because that's going to impact your bonus. Why should you help somebody else get a piece of your bonus, right? And the all of that way the corporations work, it's working against the company, is that the
Mm.
teams are being motivated to work in ways that are ineffective.
Mm.
So,
That's another line to think about. Yeah. True.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, considering the fact that now there's a lot of, like you share your knowledge, you try to trust, and then you try to work together with each other. There's also like, often people say, oh, is that like a best practice that you follow? Or is there like a framework that you follow that I would love to use? So sometimes thinking about frameworks, I think there's not enough conversations around the foundational thinking that people should develop. Like, I wouldn't want to go and ask somebody, hey, what's your framework? Rather, I would like to know, "Hey, what's the way you think?" Because let me try to understand from the way of thinking. Can I learn a thing or two? So, how do you think the shift in learning from others should be? Like, should it be more around like, you know, let me know about your frameworks, or should it be more around the kind of thinking that one can adapt from the other person and try to use that into their work?
Well, yeah, but it's certainly not frameworks, right? There's nothing agile
Mm.
about a framework, right? The the best story from this is the NUMI plant, the New United Motors plant, that's down the road from me, the Bay Area.
Mm.
Um, was one of the worst factories on the planet. And then Toyota came in, and within about 6 months, they had turned it into one of the best. And the difference was that they trusted the people working on the assembly line to improve on their own. They say, we're going to task you with the strategic goal of improvement. And we
Mhm.
don't know how to improve because you are the people who are doing the actual work. So you have to. And they came up with better ways of working. And since they were empowered, they were much happier. The absentee rate plummeted, is that they were doing vastly higher quality work. But then they took what they were doing, and wrote it up as a framework. And they took all this documentation and trundled back to Detroit and plonked it down in the factories there and said, you work the same way that they work in Fremont. And it
Mhm.
was a massive failure. Didn't work at all. And it's because what made it work was that the people who were doing the work came up with the way of working that worked best for them.
Mhm.
And you look at a framework like Scrum, and it's exactly that problem, right? It's here a bunch of people, back 20 some years ago, developed Scrum on a team, and it worked really well for them. And then
That's
they came up with this fallacy. So therefore it must work well for everybody else. And that's nonsensical. Doesn't work that way. And so we all have to develop our own frameworks. Now that doesn't mean that we're inventing stuff from scratch. Is that I think it's not just sensible, but necessary to have a
Mhm.
palette of tools to draw from, to understand what works and why, and what doesn't work and why, and what's going to work in this context and what's going to work in that context, and what are the pluses and what are the minuses of every way of working. But
Mhm.
ultimately, it's up to the teams to decide how they're going to do the work, because the frameworks are just not helping us with that. So I don't believe in any of them, and the I don't even believe in them as the whole training wheel thing, right? The people say Scrum is a set of training wheels, but truth to tell, you don't learn to ride a bicycle until you take the training wheels off. And too many companies start with Scrum and they never stop. Is that, in theory, if you're doing retrospectives, you will evolve. If the company is really agile and it starts with Scrum, fine, but I wouldn't expect it to be doing Scrum a year later. And because they should evolve, right? Is they should have retrospectives and change what they're doing so that it works better for them.
Mhm.
And I'm not seeing enough of that in the real world
Right.
because of all the framework stuff, right? The certification disease doesn't help,
Mhm.
right? Because it kind of forces everybody to start thinking that the framework is more important than the people,
Mhm.
when it's people that are more important, right? It's the individuals and
Yeah.
interactions, processes,
Yeah.
tools. So all of a sudden the processes and the tools are given prominence, and I don't buy that.
Yeah. I think going back to the three C's and the kind of clarity and the communication that you want to be having within the team, and just decide what really works for you. And at this context of where you're shipping, what
Well,
you want to
within
ship.
within a larger context of knowledge, right? Is that you're not just inventing stuff. Is that you have to learn a bunch of stuff first so that you can make intelligent decisions about what's the best way to
Yeah.
do things in your context.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. Awesome. So, awesome, Alan. Thank you so much for being here on the show. And like, I think I learned a lot in terms of discussing how things were done earlier and what are some of the things that teams can start doing more towards getting effective solutioning out, which is always like starting to think about what is it that they're fundamentally not doing right? How do they go about correcting that and going on to basically building the right, not even the right, the software that your audience would need. So I think I learned a lot of things from today's conversation. I'm so glad the listeners are also trying to do that. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Happy I could be of service.
Thank you.